in this fantastic rain shadow. And I rather imagine we all wound up here for similar reasons. I'm kind of a skinny person, so I like sunbeams, and this is a great place to get them. And this is a fantastic time of year to be thinking about prairies. And if you really want to launch into prairie restoration and ecology, this is the time of year to start. This is the time to sow seed. Getting seed out into the environment is super important. The seeds seem to do the best if we just let them do their thing without any assistance other than the natural elements. So it's a fabulous time of year. And one of the things that we'll be sharing today is places to get native plant material and seed resources. We have one of our finest seed men here joining us tonight, Forrest Schomer, co-founder of Olympic Peninsula Prairies. We'll also be discussing a little bit, where does our rain shadow compare with other global Mediterranean zones? Which is pretty exciting. I just 2 years ago, I got to spend a month vagabonding around Spain, looking at the flora there. Turns out I even like lavender now. It's pretty great to see it in the wild. And we'll also talk about our ecosystem health and ways we can all help share and help protect this amazing ecosystem. So there's nothing quite like having to live in the middle of a beautiful rain shadow. And I think this satellite imagery kind of says it all. We have a range of mountains rising to nearly 8,000 feet, which blocks incoming moisture, develops our beautiful rainforests on the wet west side. And in this side, we're left with descending, warming, drying air masses. And it always seems to be, if you look around the right place, you can find this splendid blue hole. We've got an incredible diversity of elevation and moisture gradients across the Olympic Peninsula. I spend most of my time here in the dry northeast corner, which has these very interesting ecosystems, including one of the highest latitude Mediterranean chaparral environments in either hemisphere. We also have an amazing alpine area that is excessively dry, and everything in between produces this beautiful dryland flora and innumerable types of gorgeous wildflowers. We've also got we've got a dryland sense of aesthetics here too that I really love and seek out. Lots of little places you can find warm, fun spots and essence of our very dry ecosystem. We've also got a lot of interesting wildlife in our rain shadow. In fact, it was primarily prairie birds that got me interested about 30 years ago of working out here. And it became really obvious that our birds are have been highly aggrieved in this area, mostly through habitat loss and habitat alteration. We've lost quite a few of these species. And so it's always good to think about habitat alterations and perhaps ways we can bring these amazing species back. We also have an incredible diversity of plants. Nelsa Buckingham has done a fantastic job of cataloging the flora of the Olympic Peninsula. Incredible displays, very locally, of prairie species, an incredible diversity of foodstuffs, of natural foodstuffs to be had in this region. Very interesting berries, tubers, filberts, hazelnuts, root crops. Fantastic place for celebrating wild foods. And we owe a really sense of gratitude and debt to the Klallam Nation, upon whose land that we are currently residing. And it is, we just like to take a moment and recognize that we are on their traditional homelands. And this lands that we know is this area, the Squallam, they've been on this land since time memorial, and that there's 3 tribes, the Squallam, that the Klallam government oversees, and they still have very strong ties to this area. And this acknowledgement is in respect to the Squallam people and their history. The Squallam were also avid stewards of the land, including the local prairies. Ancient practices included burning the prairies to maintain the health of the land. The land that we know as Squim was inhabited solely by first people known as the Klallam's people. They show a ancestry to the occult people who We're in the pebble tool tradition, and that extends back almost 12,000 years, if not longer. So we have an extremely long residency time here of indigenous peoples and a ton to learn from them about how to manage these lands. The Scullum had at least 30 villages along the Strait of Juan de Fuca and across the water in British Columbia and even on northern Whidbey Island. Many of the villages were along the water, including the mouth of the Dungeness River and along Squim Bay. And Squim, by the way, comes from the village at Washington Harbor, which means a great place to hunt and shoot. So again, in deference to the Clallam people who also got me my 3 Moderna shots. So thank you for that. And some of the questions we have is, when did our prairie vegetation first appear? And at what point were in the early deglaciation periods, about 12 to 13,000 years ago, things became considerably warmer and drier. A lot of dry elements, flora moved in that we can see from pollen profiles and inhabited this area. And at some point during that period, the activities of the Clallam people started to enhance and modify the prairie. And in fact, during the last 5,000 years, we've entered a marine phase, a cool marine phase. And if it wasn't for the burning by Clallam peoples, a lot of our prairies would have disappeared. So the presence of their burning and tilling and harvest activities actually is a great boost for biodiversity in this area. Here's gathering with some of the Clallam people out on Quate Prairie in Port Townsend. And this is breaking soil for the prairie. Now that's a couple years in, going in over at the Dungeness River Center. Here again, we see the Olclot. We can see some important sites dating back to 13,000 years or more. And so that's a long time for one set of peoples to be inhabiting continuously one area. So we're greatly honored to be residing on these landscapes. This evening, we're just gonna quickly run through some of the factors in climate that shape our prairies, our Mediterranean zone, rain shadow, geology. We'll talk a little bit about fire. We're also gonna talk about the indigenous uses of these areas. We're gonna talk about what is a prairie, define a prairie, talk about conservation and ways we can help restore this, in many ways, highly endangered ecosystem. And it's been amazing the last couple of years because there's been just an incredible groundswell in interest in local foods. People are realizing that we can't necessarily always rely on ships and Safeway trucks rolling up to provide us. And so it's been a fantastic couple of years to interact with folks, stay local, and think about ways we can help protect this ecosystem. And one of the reasons why we wanted to call this meeting was that we are witnessing a terrible tragedy here on the Squim Prairie. Our soils here that extend back at least 4,000 to 5,000 years from the known burning activities and even longer, they're incredibly cultural artifacts in addition to being highly productive. And it's time that we gave this amazing resource its due and thought more about protecting it. And we just had recently a really positive interaction with some developers and the tribes and Green Crow Industries and developers of just saying, before they develop, letting us come in and do a dig for native plants and remove them to the prairie out at Railroad Bridge Park. So there's a lot of interest, and it seems like whether it's the city of Squim, other municipalities, developers, there's like, what can we do to help? So that's what this evening is all about, sharing ideas and resources. And the area that we speak about, primarily the West Cascadia Prairie Province, as you can see here, up through southwest British Columbia, Western Washington, and Western Oregon, is this amazing prairie province. A lot of it has rain shadow, and we're far enough north that we see a lot of wonderful species. You can see on the northwest coast there can you see my cursor okay? See if I can get that up too. You can see here on the Olympic Peninsula, Forrest and I were interested in actually expanding. There's a group called the Cascade Prairie Oak Partnership. And we went to one of their conferences and we realized there wasn't a lot of representation out on the Western Olympic Peninsula. There's a lot of fabulous prairies. So that's when we had the idea to establish the Olympic Peninsula Prairies. It's one of 7 other regional prairie organizations that focuses exclusively on prairie ecology. And one of the things that we're really interested in for our budding organization is anyone with webmaster skills that wants to volunteer and join our team, please leave us a note in the chat or look us up afterwards. So we are technically in a Mediterranean zone. And Mediterranean zones, there's 5 of them globally. And we, you can see our red square up there. We're actually the highest latitude Mediterranean zone on the planet. We are connected to the California Mediterranean zone. All of the 5 global Mediterranean zones on the planet, they're characterized by summer dry and winter wet systems. And that's exactly what we have here. We're sufficiently far north that if we didn't have the Olympic Mountains, we'd actually be pretty rainy. It would still have relatively dry summers, which is one of the basic features of a Mediterranean zone. So we're wonderfully high latitude Mediterranean zone. We'll talk a little bit about some of the Mediterranean enhancers, which make this place, give us our dryland flora. But what's really cool is that just up the coast in Southeast Alaska are the lowest latitude tidewater glaciers on the planet. So this is a really interesting area, the Inside Passage, in that we've got very northward Mediterranean zone and very southward glaciers. Same thing with the glaciers in the Olympic Mountains. For this latitude, they're the lowest occurring ice on the planet. So a pretty exciting area to have all this incredible diversity. I have the good fortune of working quite a bit down in California with colleagues at UC Davis. And I love kicking around, looking at their flora and trying to see what are factors within global Mediterranean zones, in particular the California Mediterranean zone, that characterize these areas. Certainly one of them, there's lots of reptiles. We've got a couple species of lizards that you can find here in our Rainshadow. We've certainly are a great place for growing Mediterranean crops like lavender. We've got a whole lavender thing going, everyone knows about in this region. And you can see that our Mediterranean zone is like other areas, summer dry, winter wet. And Mediterranean zones occur because there's an uneven distribution of heat that arrives at the planet Earth. Most of the heat arrives in the equatorial region from the sun. That sets up a convection cell. So moisture and heat moves towards the poles, and cold area moves from the poles back towards the equatorial region. Those split into these various large high and low pressure systems and storm tracks. So we just happen to be positioned right in the area where the storm track alternates back and forth, giving us dry summers and wet winters. So you can see the migration of the storm track between summer and winter, and we're in one of these perfect spots. This is a Köppen map. This is just an idealized structure of what, if there was just one continent on planet Earth, you would see that the equatorial region is a mirror image of itself. And so you have Mediterranean zones in the southern hemisphere and in the northern hemisphere. This continent is proportionally shaped to the amount of land that we find in both the northern and southern hemisphere. Mediterranean zones occur on the western sides of continents where the prevailing trade winds blow alternately across spring and summer. Here again, you can see here we sit very far, a Mediterranean zone that's moved very far north into the normally marine ecosystem with tidewater glaciers not very far away. And it's our dry summers and the fact that we also, other links to the California province is that we can grow succulents here, which is pretty great. This is a typical scene down in the Central Valley, California. Here we are on Spiden Island up in the San Juan Island. So you can see a lot of similarity there. Natural, open, growing prairie ecosystems bounded by conifers and oak. Here we are in West Squim. We even got some aspen, which is an interior species, nice to have in the mix. Mediterranean zones are characterized by being tough on tree growth. Right when plants need the moisture most in summertime, well, it gets pretty dry around here. And so this causes tree mortality, and that helps keep the prairies open. So I spend a lot of time kicking around and looking at tree health and particularly tree mortality. Because in the absence of fire, ways to keep the prairies and, keep the conifers and shrubs from encroaching onto the prairie ecosystems is really important. Typical of Mediterranean zones, you see a lot of wind sculpted, dry, arid vegetation, particularly the trees out in exposed areas. Fire is also a really big part of Mediterranean zones, and we see what happens if we don't allow natural processes like fires and fuel reduction to occur. We unfortunately get these catastrophic large wildfires. And that's why prescribed burning is such an important tool, and why it's great to consult with the local clown people, because they have been burning here for thousands of years highly successfully. And I think there's a lot we could learn from them on how to manage landscapes and gradually return fire to the landscape in a way that reduces fuels and minimizes hazards for people. Grazing also tends to be a big factor in Mediterranean zones. What's really cool is that you get pin cushioning of the vegetation is a feature. I got to see this all over Spain. It was really cool. And so you see it in our vegetation here, predominantly in our premier chaparral species, the manzanita. But you look at these patches of it, and it often has this very distinctive rounded Mediterranean-like pin cushioning. It's also very similar. It's in the same genus as Madrona. It's got the beautiful bark. So I spent a lot of time hiking off trail looking for these islands of Mediterranean zone in the Sea of Conifers. Also, exposed rock is pretty typical of Mediterranean zones because the flora, it has to deal with the dry period. Get a lot of very interesting aromatic herbs. One of the things that we share, this is out on the Quimper Peninsula and some of the active dune areas, we share a similarity with the Southern California Mediterranean zone by having a soft sage community, which is really cool. These soft aromatic sage relatives. Mediterranean zones, as we can see here, they get going very early in the season. In fact, it's the rains that came in October that really get our fall green up going. And right now, if you were to start looking at the bulbs, they're already underground starting to sprout. So the prairie is right now coming alive, even though it's the dead of winter, stuff is starting to grow. So by the time that February rolls around, you can already see the camas are starting to shoot up, and some of our species are already even blooming by then, like our early pink-eyed grass. We share our Madrona berries. They're really typical of these. In the Mediterranean zones, we have the strawberry tree. Here we've got our Madrona trees. We've also share the genus Quercus of oaks with the Mediterranean zone, both in California and in Europe. Here we are on the Squim Prairie, beautiful remnant patches of oak. Other distinctive species that we have here are the Western yew. We've got a couple other introduced species of Artemisia mugworts that do pretty well here. So it's great to kick around and look at our dryland flora and see how we connect to other places in the world. And one of the important, what I call Mediterranean enhancers, in addition to our regional global climate, we discussed briefly, is the Olympic Rainshadow. The Olympic Rainshadow, it absorbs a lot of moisture on the wet west side. And then when the air descends into the east side, drying and warming, compressing, things get really dry. But if you go over to the wet west side, you can see these incredible rainforests over there. World record trees of all 5 dominant conifer species, huge production of biomass, fantastic biodiversity. Then you come to the other side of the peninsula, and here we have this fantastic little rain shadow. And it doesn't seem to matter where you are. Usually the rain shadow is very mercurial. If there's incoming rain systems, although it didn't seem there was much of a rain shadow last night, it got almost like an inch of rain out here, even out on the Squim Prairie. But usually there's this blue hole somewhere that you can find if you poke around. And the clouds are very pastel-like here. It's not a place where we have like towering thunderheads. This is a place where we tend to have stratus clouds that are actually going away. This is like Thunderhead's graveyard. This is where clouds come to die, right? So our clouds tend to be pretty modest, but very beautiful when the sun sinks into the rain shadow or rises. And if you're opposite of the rain shadow, you get these beautiful sunsets and sunrises. Joyce gets beautiful sunrises because the sun is rising through the rain shadow and casting its rays underneath. So I spent a lot of time chasing rain beams. Here we see a rainfall map with our nice little dry area just up here in the corner around Sequim, Woodby Island, Quimper Peninsula, Miller Peninsula, and the Sequim Plateau. Looking back at the Olympic Mountains from San Juan Island, you can see here, here's a storm track coming in, huge amounts of precipitation occurring around us. But you can see here how the rain shadow now has sort of dropped down around the corner. Because the winds are coming from the west-northwest, the rain shadow shifts over towards Seattle. So it's kind of always opposite where the prevailing winds are coming. We've learned a lot about pineapples this fall. Here's this atmospheric plume of river coming up. What's really crazy about this area is that we have a wind tunnel, then a rain shadow, then a convergence zone, and another wind tunnel. So the interplay of these is a really interesting, and it helps define our climate. Because we're a circular rain shadow, we actually have bilateral symmetry. And it's really neat when you tromp around here. If you're over here around Quilcene, you look at the vegetation and flora and climate, you go over here and you can find over by Joyce kind of a mirror image of itself. So we'll talk a little bit about this tonight, is this bilateral symmetry and this symmetry line that runs right down through the Olympic Peninsula. Compared to another dry zone, we're unusual in that we're what's called a dipolar rain shadow. Because the wet Pacific winds and solar input come from the same direction, our rain shadow falls on a north slope. And that's kind of crazy because that means that most of our rain shadow areas, they're sloping away from the equator. That tends to dampen the intensity of the rain shadow. Now you compare that with the Big Island in Hawaii, and there the solar input and comes from the south, but the prevailing weather systems come from the northeast. And so that means that the rain shadow falls on slopes that orient towards the equator, which intensifies their rain shadow here, the rain shadow in Hawaii. And this is very typical of a lot of our bluffs. They are steep bluffs and they point to the north. And that makes it challenging for rain shadow flora until you get out into these plateau-like areas out where we have rolling Sequim Plateau, Quimpers, Miller Peninsula, where you can get local variations in topography that start to produce southward orienting slopes that bring in a lot more solar heat. Dungeness Spit's another fantastic spot for dryland flora. Graveyard Spit, very open country. Now, this is technically more of a dune land, but it does also have a lot of prairie plants. Here we look at some heat and rainfall maps, and you can see again that the blue is rainfall, the red represents sunshine. You can see across the year in Sequim, right when solar input is maximum, rain is the least. So you'll see this all over the world in Mediterranean zones, this typical pattern. And precipitation getting much lower, out to probably as low as 16, maybe 15 inches. I mean, we don't even know how dry our rain shadow is because much of it falls over marine waters of eastern Straits of Juan de Fuca. It could be 13, maybe even 10, down to a true desert out there. And there's no topography to lift the rains up. Here we see the keel of, a very good example, the keel of the convergence zone right here with the rain shadow up towards the San Juans in the distance. This is taking the ferry over on the Keystone Ferry. So climatically, we live in a really cool area. Here we see the convergence zone developing. And again, it tends to develop opposite of the prevailing winds. As the winds rush around the Olympics and join again, they collide. There's some upward convection, it's upward movement, cooling, condensing, creating the rainfall. In our topography in the Olympic Peninsula, we have a radial topography of our major rivers, essentially almost like 12, like a dozen or so major rivers radiating out from the central core. And that produces a whole diversity of topographies for dryland plants to find southern exposures on. You go up to the San Juan Islands, and it's fantastic up there. This is the juniper forest on Fidalgo Island. They orient towards the south because they are, their topography allows them to orient towards the equator, so they get a lot of solar input. Here in Sequim, along of our paleo terraces from the ancient Dungeness River, and some of our very interesting eskers that form beneath the ice sheets, they form this low rolling topography that can create some very awesome dry sites. Go up into the mountains in the Elwha Valley, you can see this fabulous basalt type country where basalt is the most erosionally resistant rock in the Olympics. It tends to form the prominent areas, and upon those we get fantastic prairie type and rocky outcrop flora. Here you can see, here's the peak glaciation, the continental glaciers came down, and when they covered they didn't overrun the Olympics, they moved around it. That left area up in the subalpine unglaciated for probably, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of years. When the glaciers came down, the Juan de Fuca lobe went west, the Puget lobe went to the south, and it tended to carve out these really cool east-west valleys up to the north. Solduck Valley is a good example. And that provides excellent southward exposure. Another huge factor is the glaciers dumped a ton of unconsolidated materials, coarse gravels, relatively low nutrient coarse gravels that water percolates out through. So covering all of our area, we have this highly porous, high porosity type sediments that the water quickly percolates out through and reduces tree growth and increases the likelihood that open plants are going to inhabit this area. So I'm drinking a Guinness here. This is the official beer of Prairie Restoration with the nitrous widget and coffee. Ooh, ooh. So lots of pollinators too. Open country is great. Warm open country areas is fabulous for pollinating animals. And that's been a huge conservation concern, is our loss of native pollinators. So by recovering prairies, we can provide important habitat, breeding, nectaring, and feeding sites for these animals. Talk a little bit about bunchgrass and grasslands. Now, within our Mediterranean zone, we've got these amazing grasslands, and grasslands occur around the planet. They cover about 10% of the Earth's surface, and grasslands plus savannas. Savannas means you have trees, you have an open forest canopy that allows for an understory grasses to develop. So got lots of that in our area. And grasslands are important for human evolution. It's thought that during the last 10 million years that grasslands kind of came into their fore with a drying and warming planet. And it was that human evolution was really important to these areas. And there's some that maintain that even our visual aesthetics are associated with open ecosystems. One of the reasons why probably humans cut down trees every time we get the chance is because we like sunshine and because we have this ancient connection to savanna environments. In grasslands, they're characterized simply that they're dry places, particularly for the year-round moisture enough that it reduces tree growth. They're dominated by grasses. Evaporation exceeds rainfall. There's lots of fire, and there's also lots of browsers and grazers. Here we see this quarter for Kansas, and we actually do share a lot of ecological similarities with the prairies of the Midwest. And it's partially through the fact that when we have grasses dominating, they're fibrous rooted. The vast majority of the biomass is actually underground in a grass plant. That allows humuses to build up when these roots die and decay, start to produce these really wonderfully dark soils. And that's when, so even though these soils tend to be low nutrient here, once you get a grassland established, they start building up the soils. This here is red fescue. This is a plant that we grew, we planted last fall, and it grew. And you look at the root structure. This is just after like I think only a month of growth in the middle of winter. It's amazing how quickly plants can grow here that are adapted for this climate. They'll grow in the winter. Here we see our plains out here, our tall grass prairie and our short grass prairie where it's drier in the middle of our continent. These are where we find our grasslands out here on the West Coast. Just a quick comparison, our Olympic prairies we're a lot more mild. Because of the ocean, we don't get as cold and we don't get as hot in the summer. We also get a lot of our prairies developed right along marine frontage, where other factors like extra solar radiation from reflectance, as well as salt spray and ionization, help open up the prairie ecosystems tougher on vegetation plants. We are one of the driest places in North America here in the summer because we don't go monsoonal, which the prairies of the Midwest do. So pretty neat. And we're just gonna run around, let's look at some bunch grasses. This is up on one of the balds up above the Elwha Valley. You'll notice there's a lot of open terrain in between the bunches of grass. That shows it's a really high quality, minimally disturbed. This is away from any roads and trails, these outcrops. So very few exotic weeds have gotten in there, and its structure and species composition probably closely replicates the paleo condition. And when you're looking for bunch grass, from afar, they have this kind of grainy texture from the individual bunches. That's a great cue initially to go in and realize that, hey, we've got something good going on here. We also have large swaths of Romer's fescue. It's also called red fescue or Idaho fescue at low elevation. This is over in the Keystone area on Whidbey Island. You can see the bunches of grass. Here are the small seed heads, the spikelets, the grass florets that are very vigorous growth. There's not much endosperm in them. You'd think they're really light and fluffy. You'd think they were actually, I've been out with agronomists before and said, God, it looks like the crop failed this year, huh? There's nothing in these, but you go plant them and they go crazy. So red fescue is an amazing plant. In the dune areas, we have a poa, another native bunch grass, Poa macrantha, the dune bunch grass, which is beautiful. You can see that growing in a number of dune areas around the peninsula. Our red fescue is characterized by oftentimes having the sheaths of the grass are persistent around the base, forming a very distinctive feature. So so when I'm hiking around, I'm always looking for these clumps of grass. Here we see a nice red fescue or Romer's fescue with the persistent sheaths on the base. These plants are beautiful in winter too, because they grow in the winter, but they also have this beautiful lighter colored tufts. We can see why we call it red fescue. This picture is not color corrected. That is the true color of some of our red fescues, particularly when they grow in more estuarine environments. The Idaho fescue or red fescue can grow pretty tall, up to several feet, particularly in more shaded sites. This is shout out for at H.J. Carroll Park, there's a fantastic native gardens that have been established there, and they've got a cute little bunch grass zone. So the name of that prairie restoration, Como Kushan, do I have that right? If you get out there, it's a fabulous place to look at native plants. They have an incredible collection there, probably outside of some of the native prairies. It's definitely got the finest collection of native plants, I would say, here on the Olympic Peninsula. So these are bunch grasses. This is another species of bunch grass. This is prairie June grass, fabulous native, more red fescue. We also have some of these taller grasses, the Sitka bromes. This is really cool. This is out at Miller Peninsula. This is a site that got developed, but the developers, they planted bunch grass after they were done. So big shout out to them. You could argue that we also have kind of a tall grass ecosystem. This is out on the Miller Peninsula. Some of our blue wild rye gets to several feet high, 5-6 feet high, even over your head, kind of simulating the tall bunch grass prairies in the Midwest. This is very typical of our open savanna type environments where the grasslands can exist under an open tree canopy. Here was our red fescue in a short grass environment. But what's really cool about grasses is that they've really come into their own as landscape elements. You see lots of people growing and using grasses as part of their design. Here's our cat. It thinks it's a puma out on the prairie, sitting in the red fescue. But you see lots of landscapers now using grasses for good reason, because they're beautiful and they're hardy, and they don't mess up your sidewalks when they grow. This is fantastic work done by the National Park Service. Here we see this is the restoration activity that's going on up on the Hurricane Ridge Road for the new entrance booth. And they've got, look at that, bunch grasses they're planting along the side of the road. Fantastic. Talk a little bit about our soils. So because that we get these huge root masses, over time, we get these beautiful soils building up over thousands of years. And you look in and you can see this beautiful black moloch, or it's called a mollisol, these dark, beautiful soils. One great place to inspect soils is you look for mounds by moles when they push soil up to the surface. This is on the Quimper Peninsula, highly sandy soils in this site. Nice cutaway where you've got road cuts or perk holes. You could get a good look at these beautiful, dark prairie soils that took thousands and thousands of years to develop. They're extremely precious, and they are highly fertile. You can see again that there's a lot of, they get very crumbly, and because root growth exceeds the ability of the decay of the dead material, builds up these beautiful soils over time. And then because up in the subalpine too, there's lots of fabulous, fabulous types of bunch grasses you can see up there, including our Romer's fescue. And again, a really important part that favors our open grassland environments is the fact that we have all of these glacial materials that were deposited that allow water to percolate through and favor grasses over trees. This is a really cool ecosystem on the Quimper Peninsula. It's out on the bluffs there. You've got a Supalali, Sitka spruce ecotone. It's really bizarre, very localized. We see some typical bluff environments, again, where we get lots of open ecosystems and where that doesn't look like great soil, these gravels. And it's great for cactus, right? Cactus is at the very far end of the moisture spectrum. I mean, a lot of our wetlands actually used to, you look at the old maps, they used to actually, our prairies would go right into wetland environments. Those were the principal camas growing areas. And the opposite of the moisture spectrum, we have our succulents, including our little prickly pear cactus with several amazing persisting native populations. Stuff is super easy to grow. It's fun to grow. It's animal dispersed. It blossoms. It doesn't appear to give any seed. Other species of cactus also grow well here in Sequim. You can see after these pears were knocked off, carted around, once they were planted, they just go nuts. I mean, you just drop them on the ground. And if they sense that this is a good place to grow, they'll put down roots remarkably fast for a succulent. Other succulents include our stone crops, some of our Lewisia relatives, also indicative of our Rainshadow Mediterranean zones. Again, our soft sages or aromatic mugworts. Locally, we've got some really cool, these amazing little localized soft sage communities, which links us to the southern parts of the California Mediterranean zone. This is the boreal mugwort. And up at high elevation, there's lots of species of these aromatic herbs, particularly in the Artemisia family. Worth checking out. Very diagnostic of our area, of course, is the Pacific madrona, related to the strawberry tree of the European Mediterranean zone. We also have amazing areas for junipers. This is again back out at the serpentine zones on Fidalgo Island. Here we up the Dungeness, beautiful juniper. We don't get juniper at sea level. It usually occurs about 3,000 feet and above. That was noted by Nelson Buckingham, suggesting that it was above ice contact where the juniper survived on the peninsula. We do have it at sea level here on Northern Whidbey Island. Great aromatic species used extensively by indigenous peoples for medicines and adhesives. Also got indicative of our area is the Gary oak. Around the Sequim Prairie, Gary oak is the dominant emissary from our former, once was a massive prairie province. Stan Graham and Dave Peters of the US Forest Service out of Olympia have done extensive work of mapping our prairies in our area. And they note that most of the flora of the Sequim Prairie has been disappeared. What was thought to be perhaps as many as 15 to maybe 20,000 acres of open grasslands and then partially closed canopy savannas. And it's great to have these Gary oaks around because they remind us of how extensive this area was. They're doing pretty well. there are very few places where they can regenerate. So that's why some of the work that's being done out at Robin Hill Park to bring back these groves by Bob Stillquist and Anita McMillan, the Department of Wildlife. Terry Blake Park, there's a fantastic Gary Oak system going in over there. And again, reptiles are big in Mediterranean zones, dry areas, and we're no different. Just real quickly, how do we learn about these ecosystems? Some of the techniques that I use to study former grasslands is tree architecture is huge. Look for these open grown trees that are indicative of past open environments. So tree architecture is really big. The trees in an open growing environment, especially a windy environment, they tend to grow very squat like wolf trees. And you can see these. Nowadays, you find them mostly in the forest because of fire suppression. The forest has moved in around them and starts to jeopardize the health of these trees. Even though it's their own offspring that are growing it, it's kind of weird. But they shade these trees out, which is very unfortunate. So that's why some selective cutting can be really beneficial to these gnarled wolf trees. Here we see some subalpine firs up at in the subalpine areas. Tree ring dating is really important. That can tell you a lot about historical climates, about the age of trees, about when these areas became non-forested. I spent a lot of time looking at tree rings. I do very little coring simply because if you look around enough, you can usually find dead material of this in the area and of the age class that you're interested in, to actually just count them. So we have a huge extensive trail and road network. There's always trees cut along these that you can look for aging these trees and inferring about past environments. Also, the presence of charcoal and fire scars tells us about past prairie areas. Keep your eyes peeled for those. Even in stumps that you'd think you could never be able to date, that are so decomposed back to the initial logging, well, if you just start to look closely, you can find little pieces of them that are still intact, and you can start to extrapolate the age of these trees by looking at these individual chunks or floaters within the decomposed core. Very typical area, 3 o'clock ridge, you can see these sites are gradually being grown in by trees, very slowly, but steadily. These sites gradually disappear without some sort of proactive management that stimulates the disturbance of past Native Americans and unsuppressed lightning fires. So tree death is really important. Looking for stressed trees, and that tells you that these sites are so stressed that trees are going to have difficulty establishing here. This is particularly true of our rock outcrops in the mountains, our chaparral environments. They tend to do pretty well resisting tree invasion. Same thing with our open dune areas, which get so dry it's difficult for trees. Also looking at the soils, this is a lot of work that Dave Peters and Stan Graham have done, is mapping soils around the Olympic Peninsula. A lot of times they're built on these very coarse textured soils, but coarse textured unconsolidated materials, but over time they establish amazing soils. We also look for indicator plants of old prairie areas, just poking around, looking for any species that persists there from the former prairie can tell you that this was a historical prairie site. Occasionally we get up above to look down from airplanes to peek at these prairies. Old photographs are fantastic for defining old prairie areas. The literature, there's books and general land survey reports, diaries, soil surveys, newspapers, articles, scientific articles, all talk about old prairie areas. Fire reports, fire ecology is really important for figuring out past environments. This is the Dodwell-Rixton map. Now, these were the true heroes of exploration of the Olympic Peninsula. 1898 through 1901, they mapped virtually the entire Olympic Peninsula. And pay attention to here, these prairies out on the west side. Note the juxtaposition between wetlands and these prairie areas. So oftentimes the prairies were actually in some of the lushest, most richest growing sites for their cannabis beds. Now we think of prairies as being these sites in the very driest, rockiest, resistant areas. That's just because everything else has been, these sites get immediately usurped by settlers when they showed up, because they were the best growing sites for their crops and for running animals. So restoring these sites, this is an important thing, a habitat to look at. And associated habitats, again, with prairies are the savanna environments where you get open enough understories that the grasslands can occur underneath them. This is this amazing, some of these wolf trees that occur in the northern Quipper Peninsula. Again, you can see, notice this tree is growing now in a dense canopy, but it was open growing for the estimates of this tree are perhaps 500, 600, maybe 650 years old. And in less than 50 years, the other trees have grown up around it. So we see some very interesting change in the soil moisture relationships that allow trees to grow a lot faster in modern times. Beach habitats, again, dunes and cobbles along beach areas are fantastic for finding not only dune flora or strand flora, but prairie species that also occur out on these sites. Some of these little sand spits that occur on the North Olympic Peninsula, they can project out from the shading bluffs and produce these fabulous areas for prairie plants to occur, commingling with, of course, our member of the 4 o'clock family and our sea thrift. Grindelias also typifies these sites, blue-eyed Mary. So lots of coastal areas that support, here we are out at Crescent Beach, that support these additional prairie plants. Glacial bluffs are also great for supporting prairie plants. Coastal rocky headlands, locally around Marrowstone and Indian Island, has some fabulous outcrops right at sea level. Also really cool is along rivers. That's a great place to look for prairie plants where the steepness, the basalt, the rockiness, and the flooding of the river can clear away vegetation and produce it for prairie species. Heading up into the mountains upslope, lots of rocky areas that support rocky outcrop flora. And up in the subalpine, we see a fabulous interface between prairie plants and subalpine species. Also in areas where you have extensive snow deposition and slides, these places, these landslide areas can be opened up enough, steep, craggy, hard scrabble areas from snow and debris avalanches to keep them open for open growing plants. And also fires, again, you can see these, the jagged tree line up in subalpine, which is fabulous for prairie plants. And when you're looking for prairie plants, a great place to find them is around old graveyards. Like there's a really nice, at the drive-in movie theater in Port Townsend has got some great prairie shrubs growing around it. Any place that has an edge that has not been allowed to proceed ecologically through plant succession can support prairie vegetation. So let's just run around the Olympic Peninsula real quick and take a look at some of these prairie sites. They occur all the way around the Olympic Peninsula. And you think of prairies as being essentially a form of lower timberline. They're great places of biodiversity in the dry sites all the way to the very wettest sites. These are the maps that Dave Peters and Stan Graham have put together. And I want to give a shout out for their organization, Prairie Prowlers. If you're looking to do volunteer work and help us map these prairie ecosystems, I urge you to get in touch with Dave. Here's his email. You can also get it from me after the show. And they are a fabulous resource for getting out into the field and mapping some of these sites. And you can see right here, we know there's lots of prairie areas out on the Miller Peninsula, but there's no mapped prairies out there yet. So get busy, people. There's Dave Peters. He does much of his work down in the formerly 10,000 acre bare grass savannas around the Skokomish River. Here in the North Olympic Peninsula, starting on Whidbey Island and moving west, lots of great prairie areas you can see up here around Whidbey Island. And again, these areas represent soil types and mapped prairies, but the prairies often extended well inland of these areas because the canopies were sufficiently open enough. EB Prairies, fantastic. Great resource is the Pacific Rim Institute on Whidbey Island. They are kind of like us here at Quatai Prairie with the Washington Native Plant Society. They discovered a 1 little acre remnant in the back of this state pheasant farm. And they've subsequently built a huge institution, a restoration institution around this place. So they're a fantastic resource over on Whidbey Island. Marrowstone Island also got some fabulous open areas, particularly along the bluff areas, along in the northern areas and the southern areas. It also has the type locality for Gary Oak that was gathered by David Douglas. Chinook prairies are fantastic. They have virtually 0 prairie plants left, but it's a fantastic candidate for restoration, the core Chinook prairies, simply because there's lots of high quality prairie sites around the perimeter of the Chinook prairie, of which we can re-inoculate the core area. Chinook prairies were probably once really important for wetland vegetation, the semiannual mucks that they're interfaced extensively with the former camas areas. Those unfortunately disappeared during the early industrial age when this area was once called New Pennsylvania, around Irondale and Hadlock. That area had some of the most heavily industrialized area on the coast north of California. They mined the bogs to get bog iron out of there, and that resulted in the loss of these great prairie areas. Here you can see some of the open sites where we're probably former. These are the mapped prairie areas by Dave and Stan's work, but the prairies themselves are probably much more extensive than that. So I love kicking around the Chimacum Prairie, magic soils, beautiful dark soils, and still kind of got that essence of an old prairie area, which is really wonderful. This is a budding prairie. The prairie, in addition to the prairie at H.J. Carroll Park, there's also a prairie that's been established at the Chimacum Middle School. And this is Corey Chin, and several of the parents and teachers there got this prairie started. And in just a year and a half of work, there is an amazing little prairie that's been established. So prairies have always been a lot of work. We know that from our Clallam elders, and it takes a lot of effort to dig and till and plant and weed and burn. But you give a little bit of attention and the prairie comes back really quickly. And so around the Quimper Peninsula, we see these places that have that large rock, Chimacum Rock, that has prairie species on that. Beckett Points, fabulous prairie species. Chevy Chase Golf Course was thought once to be a prairie area. A lot of work there to restore that one. There's aspen locally. The Port Townsend Airport got aspen, and that was Forest studies this prairie quite a bit, trying to bring this one back. Lots of bluff areas that support prairie plants, so we could bring the ecosystem restoration back to the fold. Then, of course, there's the Washington Native Plant Society administered, and the city of Port Townsend and the Port Townsend Spring Valley Golf Course. This is a fantastic little prairie, and this is the one where I go when I really want to be renewed and think about the history of this area. It's a fantastic area. It's been well managed. It's been burned several times. Dixie Llewellyn and her colleagues, the Native Plant Society, also Forrest Schomer, has done a lot of work in making this a fantastic, high quality prairie ecosystem. The Miller Peninsula differs a little bit, and it's got a lot of shrub species on it. It's mostly forested, but you do see really well-developed areas of a bunch of different species of really cool dryland shrubs. 2 species of Theanosis, manzanitas, rhododendrons. It's boxwoods, so it's got some really cool, this is Ceanothus, really interesting prairie areas, plus out at Diamond Point, quite an interesting history about there in this area. And along the shore of Squim Bay, there's some really interesting pocket groves of oak that grow on steep glacial bluffs, which is a really cool variation on a theme. But typically you see oak out of the middle of these large valley bottom savannas. And of course, then there's Protection Island, which is a fantastic open grassland ecosystem. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service administers this place, and they have been very interested, in addition to the wildlife out there, and also starting restoration efforts out in this area. And around in the Squim Prairie, classic prairie area here. I mentioned earlier, probably about 15 to 20,000 acres of former prairie estimated by Dave and Stan. The yellow areas represent the mapped prairie areas, but again, probably much of the entire Squim Peninsula was under an open canopy of Douglas fir with grassland species growing underneath it. So we know that this area is under heavy development pressure, but there's still a lot of open sites that remain that are candidates for prairie restoration. And what's really cool is that as you putter around the Squim Prairie, you notice these really interesting groves of oak growing on these mounds of rocks. These rocks, this is out at Spore Seam Prairie. This is a prairie that has recently had a lot of interesting, through a collaborative venture with the tribes and with Green Crow Industries before the site was developed. This is a green belt. The SQUIM municipal code does not allow any cutting of oak. And so these oaks are preserved in a green space, and in the patches within this Spore-Scene Prairie, they're going to be developed. Green Crow Industries, they were super cool about letting us get in there and collect some of the prairie plants and areas to be developed. And so it seems like most municipalities and developers, they are happy to work with you, but they just need information and they need us on the ground to identify these sites before they're developed. Some of the really interesting, cool plants that you do see locally growing around the SQUIM Prairie. Of course, big, really important one is the cactus. Flowering dogbanes, really cool, indicative of these sites. We get these really cool, dry, south-facing paleoterraces that were formed by the ancient Dungeness River meandering on its floodplain. It's very typical of SQUIM. You see patches of dead cedar. It just gets so dry here in the summer, fluctuations in the water table, changes the moisture relationships, and so you see lots of patches of dead cedar. At higher elevation, you start to see some of the open meadows, south-facing meadow areas that possibly also were sites for former prairie plants like the tiger lily and the camas. Camas is super important because it has these wonderful bulbs that, the camas bulbs were so important to the Clallam peoples that they say it was the second most heavily traded food resource after the choicest cuts of smoked salmon. Gives you an idea of, so camas has been completely extirpated from the SQUIM Prairie. There's one collection was made out on Protection Island, but it was formerly probably had thousands of acres of camas. And so we're excited to see a budding new prairie with camas out at the Burridge Park River Center. Here's one of our Tilia grandiflora and rhododendrons. Also, again, river areas where the rivers flow down towards the SQUIM Prairie. And its adjacent areas. Here we are on the Elwha. You can see these fabulous prairie areas on these sites. Moving out to the west side of the Olympic Peninsula, you can see that Stan and Dave have mapped some prairies out there. Quileute Prairie, Forks Prairie, Sappho Prairie. Here's the Beaver Prairie, a site that still contains camas. This photograph was taken before the turn of 2 centuries ago now, I think in 1890. You can see this big prairie area here on the south-facing slope. Now over time, you can see, I think this was like 1820 with the farms established here. You can see this prairie area disappearing. You can see the ingrowth of the trees. With no burning, the prairies disappear. This is about 25 years ago. This was 2 years ago. So this is what happens if we don't simulate past burning and tilling practices, prairies go away. And it's great because like cows actually, moderate grazing is actually can be a friend of the prairies because you need something to keep the growth at bay. And so intelligent, mild intensity browsing of livestock can actually be beneficial and simulate previous browsers that we had here, including elk and deer. You can see here, here's the Forks Prairie, beautiful area, but you can see these spruce invading the site. They real quickly disappear if you don't have some form of disturbance out there. I call it the green wave because you look at old photographs and you can see these old prairie areas, but you can see emerging out of the adjacent prairie savanna, this green wave of vegetation that has continued unabated until today. Some of our wetlands, now camas is an amazing plant. It's got an extremely broad ecological tolerance and it'll grow from some of the drier sites like Kaitai Prairie, but you can also find it growing in almost pure sphagnum on the west side. So hard to go wrong with camas. It's a really fun plant to grow and because it can tolerate a lot of different conditions. Here we see the tree lupin introduced onto the Quileute Prairie, Quileute Airfield, but you can still find camas out here in amongst these, the airfield. And this area is up now for I guess it's on its like 25-year renewal plan where they're currently seeking input from the public about how to manage the site. So prairie aficionados, please get in touch with the Forks Chamber of Commerce and provide commentary. Some of the bogs also with bear grass out on the west side. Here we have Nita McMillan, a great friend of prairie work. She's out collecting some of her arthropods that grow in these prairie areas. Also work done by Jackie Ray and Kat Anderson looking at the prairies in the Macaw Reservation and how Indian set fires were important in the maintenance of these sites. In South Puget Sound, Chehalis area, lots of fabulous prairie areas down there. Again, the glaciers deposited tons of these unconsolidated materials. Water percolates away, so you get these fabulous oak groves dispersed throughout the area. Manzanita, this is Oak Patch Reserve down in Kitsap County, beautiful area. Here we are out in the Chehalis. Mima Mounds area is also beautiful. Unusual geologic features out there. Shelton Prairie, cool pin cushioning, natural pin cushioning of the vegetation, which is typical of Mediterranean areas. Also, the Washington Natural Heritage Program has done lots for preserving these sites with their managed burn program. Some of these areas, bear grass recovery is a huge part. Bear grass is a very important historical plant for native tribes. It made some of the finest basketry materials. The Skokomish tribe down in the Shelton area, here's the former Shelton Prairie. They made these really cool fancy baskets, extremely tight, small, decorative, as well as utilitarian baskets, huge trade items that showed up all and down the West Coast. What's cool about Shelton is there's a pretty high consciousness because Dave and Stan spent a lot of time in that area and because of the local people. If you don't mow until, say, late June, you can get these fantastic groves of camas coming up in your yard. This is a fantastic model for people's yards here on the North Olympic Peninsula. They also have down there the balsam root, the large flowered balsam root. And again, prairie birds are, there's a lot of recovery efforts, successful recovery efforts going down in the South Sound prairies because they're more closer to larger extant populations for some of these species. Burrowing owls also used to occur out on the islands in Grays Harbor in the open estuarine systems. So just moving along here, rock outcrop is also really important for, as we mentioned earlier, rock outcrop has supports a lot of these prairie species, woolly sunflower, sea blush, the Clarkia, Indian paintbrush. Some of the brodeas grow in these rocky outcrop areas. Quick look at the geology of the peninsula. You can see the brown area is where basalt tends to form the best prairie areas. You can also see because of the faulting that occurred, this is one of Roland Tabor's images, faults run east-west here. When the glaciers passed through, they carved out these east-west valleys. So Solduck Valley, Lake Crescent, we get a lot of really big grand valleys that run east-west, and on the north side, oriented with the south towards the equator, that's where you get the best prairie development. I call it the Grand Rainshadow Valley. It stretches all the way from the Solduck over to Mount Zion with the south-facing exposure, which is fabulous for plants. My buddy Samuel McCullough, he's spent a lot of time getting up and hiking up into these prairie areas. Here's a rocky outcrop areas with prairie species. Here we are in the Zion district in the Quilcene National Forest. In showing the basalt areas here, the dark is the basalt. So whenever you get basalt, you usually are going to find some pretty cool examples of chaparral vegetation. Also areas where along Hood Canal where you have rock occurring down to sea level, get fabulous rock outcrop. Here we are at Pat's Prairie. This is cool. It actually has a rhododendron. It's so dry there, the rhododendron forms this ground cover. It's almost like a rhododendron lawn, which is really neat. And also where the ancient Dungeness River and Elwha rivers carved through their floodplains, they create these south-facing meadows, which are fabulous for prairie plants, and also perched upon the glacial bluffs. So prairies are kind of distributed widely, formerly abundant, but usually in small little packages. You will see some rock outcrops down in Hood Canal. And the way that the glaciers moved out of the north, they tended to pluck more steeply to the south and more gradually sloping to the north. Just the way when the glaciers came out of the north and moved south, that was what they did. Pluck steep to the south, which created these really good escarpments for picking up solar radiation from the sun towards the equator. And again, basalt tends to be dark, it's hard, steep, it's exposed, it's probably somewhat deficient in some key nutrients, it's leached. So wherever you've got basalt in the Olympic Mountains, that's a great place to look for rocky outcrop and prairie species that occur up into these sites. Here's a fractured pillow lava. Romer's fescue prairie up on some of these basalts up in the Elwha. Here we are in Port Ludlow, even at low elevation, you can get some pretty cool plant communities, especially along the rivers. Basalt has this very typical kind of, almost looks like a brain. And again, on these sites, you tend to get more increased tree death, and so they tend to be more resistant in the time of fire suppression. These basalt areas resist pretty well. Here's the Elwha. You can see the amazing non-forested areas that tend to occur along this highly dissected landscape. Fabulous country to get up and hike around in. More examples of tree death. And here we can see sites that again have been burned historically. Areas like where they've been done for radio towers, communication sites where they have burned historically can be really good for prairie plants. We are at the Hamma Hamma area. Fabulous examples of chaparral vegetation. Here we are in the Elwha. So rocky outcrops are fabulous. And I love this part of the Olympics because when you're on the lowlands in the North Plateaus and you look back at the Olympic Mountains, what do you see? You don't see any prairies. You see backlit mountains, steamy mountains, but you go into the mountains and look back to the north and you see this incredibly open, wild, stunning chaparral landscape. So these are the rock outcrops, often associated with fringes of maple. The cool pattern you'll notice around the rock outcrops is the trees tend to get really big and ancient surrounding these rock outcrops. That's because historically the fires would burn, stand destroying fires that burned through the surrounding vegetation, the surrounding forest, but when they got to these rock outcrops, they tended to drop down to the ground because the canopy was more open. The canopy couldn't carry a contiguous fire. So typical pattern that you see on these open rocky outcrops up in the mountains. I'm just going to whip through these here. Last sites, these areas are great for nesting goat suckers, for nesting nighthawks, as well as turkey vultures. Some of these sites. You get a lot of cryptogamic or lichens and mosses forming the ground cover in these areas. Again, pin cushioning of the vegetation, lots of dry fern allies. Probably one of our coolest Mediterranean shrubs that grows out there is the low Oregon grape. It thrives in these open rocky outcrop areas, brings a lot of fall color to our area. So yeah, the lower Oregon grape, key rain shadow shrub. And even where you have basalt in the very wettest parts of the Olympic Peninsula, here we are on the Quinault Reservation, excuse me, the Quinault Forest Service District. This is Weatherwax Peak, and it gets really open and dry looking because it's got this exposed basalt, which tends to favor, not a lot of prairie plants here, but there are some. Sandstones and shells also occur in the area. They're more easily eroded, but we can get some very highly cemented sandstones, which support open land vegetation. And some of our typical species include some of these species of wild onions, slates and shales. Those are more easily eroded. They tend not to be very important prairie areas because they just don't form promontories or steep slopes of our vegetation. Wherever you've got slates and shales adjacent to basalt, you can see the basalt, it's proud and often has some of the best prairie plants. The fire is important. We don't have a lot of time to talk about fire here, but we know that fires burning in this throughout the American West can bring smoke to our areas. We also can get fires here. This was the Lake Crescent fire a few years ago. Last year? Yeah, last summer, 2 summers ago. It was like NASCAR out there along Lake Crescent. It was great. People out watching the fire. This was a really well-behaved fire. Didn't burn any structures. It opened up the landscape, probably like a historical fire was. Good kudos to suppression crews. They got in there, kept the structure safe, didn't let it run wild. It was before the big fires in California, so there was lots of resources to throw at this fire. And a lot of my fire information comes from Jim Agee, Scott Grebel, and Ed Schreiner. Here you can see this is the Griff Creek burn. It's very important for maintaining open sites at high elevation. Historically, the fires used to be really big. This was the 1701 fire that almost burned out the Pacific Ocean and down towards the southern parts of the Olympic National Forest. Fires used to be really big in this country. Periodic, we'd go several hundred years without burns, except for the small Native American burns. Then we get these big, large fires that would cover huge portions of the landscape. So lots of areas of relatively young trees. A few ancient trees with younger trees that have come in since these large fires burned through the area. It's very typical in the Dungeness. There was lots of burning around 1900. A lot of the forests there are a little over 100 years old from that big burning period. And now they form these really dense stands of dog hair, except for the really large trees that you find that survived. The very typical feature that you see in areas where the forest is moving in and shading areas, you see this is remnant of a Rocky Mountain juniper, or excuse me, Sailor Sea juniper. And so I'm just going to skip ahead here real quick. There's lots of great resources on fire if you're interested about that. Fire tends to burn, stand destroying events occur mostly from wind on the west side and fire on the dry east side. So it's, the Dodwell-Rickson did a lot of mapping, so you can go back up and correlate these burn areas. And bringing fire back to the land in a controlled fashion is going to be really important for the recovery of some of these small prairie areas, as they've done successfully at Kaitai Prairie. They've had a couple of prairie burns there that have been very successful. And it's a very localized prairie. It's protected by green areas around it, so it does pretty well. So some of these amazing food plants that historically occurred out in these prairie sites, you just look at the linguistic diversity of the North American tribes along the Pacific coast, and it gives you some idea of the underlying landscape diversity underneath it, and its ability to produce amazing paleo foods, filberts, and you have a native hawthorn, rhodeas, seeds from the tar weeds, various species of bulbiferous plants. Here we have the chocolate lily, species of onion. Here we see a chocolate lily sprouting up, several species of biscuit roots. There's also some of our open field agarics, and of course these fantastic field of camas that you see out at Kaitai Prairie in Port Townsend. So fire is important. You can have small localized controlled fires with your little weed burners, which can create conditions for plants, camas, and berry producing shrubs to grow in these areas. Here we see, this was an area on a former prairie site that the mower just kicked up some earth, and you look at the earth and it's like, oh my God, it's full of these beautiful prairie bulbs. So growing camas is really fun. We've got a couple crops of camas now that we've started, which has been really fun seeing how the different ages, here's year 1, year 2, year 3, and year 4 is when they start to bloom. Tiger lily blossoms are also important. Chocolate lily, bulbs, big biscuit roots are big. Here we see the rice root lily or chocolate lily. They have these tiny little bulbs that when they were dug up, the bulbs shattered and went out through the soil and became really important for dispersal. Supalali berries are fabulous. Some really nice stands of that on the Quimper Peninsula. Gooseberries, filberts, acorns, again, more species of biscuit roots. All can be found in great abundance if we help protect these sites. I just want to finish up with a couple notes about conservation. So the main ways that our prairies have disappeared here in the, well, throughout the American West, but also here in the dry areas of the Olympic Peninsula, is just simply a lot of people showing up. And you can see that prairie areas were immediately picked by settlers for areas to grow and for farming and for Sequim, Port Townsend, Oak Harbor, Forks. They're all built on former Aboriginally maintained sites. And first thing we did is we stopped the burning. When you stop the burning, the trees show up and start to encroach these areas. So that's a huge problem. This is one of the former savanna over on Whidbey Island, and incredibly dense that vegetation is, right? So water here on the Sequim Prairie, water was a huge thing, bringing water and agriculture to this area. Sequim Prairie formerly was one of the highest productivity dairy areas in the state of Washington. There's also huge amounts of livestock that got put out on the Squim Prairie. Prairies are robust, but they can only handle so much impacts, right? Also, these became areas of development, housing, building homes, and concrete's kind of problematic for prairies too. Also, the introduction of non-native plants. Here we have cheatgrass and ripgut grass, very unpleasant grasses, now very abundant on these sites. So managing grasses and non-natives is a huge part. Lots of chemicals get dumped on maintaining lawns. Why not have a prairie instead? Natural water, sunlight, no need for these harsh chemicals. So in terms of restoration of these sites, there's lots that can be done. Looking for prairie species around old graveyards is a great place to look for prairie plants. Old airfields is good. I mentioned the drive-in theater in Port Townsend, roadsides. These are all spaces that you can look for indicator plants. Old meadows, glacial bluffs, little pocket bluffs. You can look for prairies there, remnant prairie species. What's really important is that if you find remnant prairie plants, those are really important ones to get seed from, to continue those expanding and support them, right? Keep them in the area. These are the inoculum for new prairie areas. Here you can see, again, Stan and Dave's prairie map of the area. Again, a shout out for prairie prowlers if you're interested in this, volunteering for that activity. A lot of prairie sites, the richest growing areas tended to be in and around wetlands. Here we have Hogsback Road in the back. This is one of these former prairie areas. You go there now, half the year it's a lake, right? So you can see the deep soils that were easy to till were really important historically for growing. Prairie interface up on Fidalgo Island. Probably lots of former interface around China Gardens on Port Townsend. You can see exotic weeds moving in. Here up in the San Juans, you can see Scotch broom. And so with a little bit of effort, these sites can be maintained. This was out of the Sporcine Prairie site. This is Green Crow Industries. This is, they're sending their people out to meet with us and talk to us, and just like very helpful, like, want to dig these bulbs up before we develop the site? Have at it. They've been wonderful. And prairies are really fun. You collect some seed and you can, anybody's porch, balcony, roof, any place you've got some sunshine and material and soil, you can grow prairies. And it doesn't take long. Here we are at Chinlika Medical School. There's Corey Chin for these prairies to develop. They make great lawn plants, candidates for restoration. You know, just looking not only for these old prairie sites, but looking for sites where good areas to start a pocket prairie in your neighborhood. There's some roadsides where a number of species can do pretty well. Holy sunflower, cactus, some of the biscuit roots, they can stand pretty dry, droughty areas. So lots to be, lots of fun thoughts to do. There's great places to get seed, access for native plants. Forrest Schomer, Inside Passage in Port Townsend, great person to contact. Friendly Native nurseries in Squim. Lissa has got some prairie species. Clallam County Conservation District, they have a plant sale. Get access to the material. I get around quite a bit. I have a number of seeds that I've collected. So if you're interested, please contact me. My email's at the end. It's really fun cleaning and working with native seed and getting them back out into the environment. It is a blast. Here's my sister Catherine helping us clean and separate seeds. Finn River, they have been interested in establishing a prairie on their former prairie area. Here we see Forrest Schomer and Deborah Kelso. Here we were last week breaking ground for a new prairie. So really exciting. This is the prairie going in at the Railroad Bridge Park. So this was the actually the collections that were going on from the Sporcine Prairie, collecting the bulbs. Kids are great to get involved. They love collecting seed. They love tearing apart husks and planting. We're working with the kids at 5 Acre School for establishing a prairie. Other great resources, again, are Pacific Rim Institute over on Whidbey Island, Washington Native Plant Society. Olympic chapter is great for ideas about growing plants. Another, every couple of years, the Cascade Prairie Oak Partnership has a big conference. This one's scheduled now for October. No doubt it's going to be digital. Just getting out and exploring and seeing and examining old prairie areas is great. You can see we've got a young camas sprouting. Camas is cool. It's got two types of roots, the taproot and contractile roots that allow it to grow down into the soil. So I guess I'd like to just finish up now and happy to take any questions and have a bit of a discussion. Thank you all very much. Check the, I don't know if anybody's put any comments there in the
Hi, Fred. There are some questions. What do you think about taking off screen share so we can all kind of see
okay.
a little bit?
Roger that.
Okay. I will start with some of the questions. Let's see. Cindy wrote that you had mentioned that there were lots of organizations that promote prairies west of the Cascades. What are these organizations, and is there one for the San Juan Islands?
Let's start with the Washington Native Plant Society. Go online, wnps.org, established place to start. Pacific Rim Institute over on Whidbey Island's another one. Olympic Peninsula Prairies, our budding young organization here on the Olympic Peninsula that I co-founded with Forrest Schomer. We are, please visit our website. You can link to it through Facebook. We'd love to have your support for people to join us, set up field trips, develop initiatives in your own neighborhood. Let's see, who else? Collin County Conservation District is good for prairie species. Yeah, lots of local resources.
There's another question from Robert. He wants to know, is it possible to take a little lawn and turn it into a prairie?
Absolutely. There's no better habitat than a lawn to turn into a prairie, right? Many of them were probably former prairie areas. You can start by, see, now's a great time to start with converting your lawn because if you want to tarp it off, in fact, we have a great need for tarps to help to cover these lawn and weedy areas. You leave the tarp on, depending on what the soil's like and how much heating you get, but putting a tarp over these areas allows heat to get to the weed seed bank in the soils and kills off, and you want to leave all that soil on your lawn. So I would tarp it off right now, let it cook well into the spring, and then now's also a good time to start your prairie plants in your seeds in your flats. By the time you kill the lawn in April, it's ready for planting. So that's why now's such a great time to have these prairie discussions, because your lawn can be converted to a prairie. Probably in 6 months, you can have an amazing prairie started. Also, Pacific Rim, I have a number of plants that myself and Rosie, we've been growing over the last couple of years. Those are free for the asking. If you want some prairie plants that have already been started. We've also got, again, Pacific Rim Institute, they donated a bunch of starts, red fescue and camas to the prairie at the Chinook Middle School. So yes, convert your lawn to a prairie, absolutely.
Why don't we, that was the last of the written questions, so we could open it up now for anyone who wants to chime in.
This is Bob, and I want to point out something that arrived in my reading here a couple of years ago. In Canada, there was a study of potential impacts to Canadian forests, given various scenarios of climate change. And all in all, given the massive pine die-offs in central BC and bad news in many places, the best news really was a projected increase in oak habitat in British Columbia, and that it appeared that the climate changes are going to be beneficial, going to return a lot of our area to conditions, climatic conditions that resemble climate of, say, 7,000 years ago. And it gave me great hope because I realized that the work we're doing right now, whether it's oak restoration or prairie restoration, is in fact the arc of the seed bank and the progenitors of what may be a dramatic expansion of this kind of habitat due to otherwise unfortunate circumstances with the global climate. So it to me really makes the point that this work is not only good for restoring localities, but we are in fact in many ways creating the passage intergenerationally of this kind of habitat if circumstances favor its expansion.
Yeah, that's, thank you, Bob. Absolutely. That's the great thing about growing prairie plants is that they are locally adapted. They're climate change resilient. They, for the most part, only need water that comes out of the sky once they're established as adults. They help native pollinator communities. So I think that you're absolutely right. Getting them back out on the landscape and available to start to colonize the space that's opening up with loss of trees. I think that's very well said.
Fred, there's some more questions in the chat. Somebody wanted to know if they should use black plastic, clear plastic, or woven weed barrier, which allows moisture through when tarping off grasses.
I'm not really the best person to ask about that. There's lots of different strategies there and different times of the year and different soil types and heatings. And I mean, it's called occultation or silage tarps. There's a 5 mil silage tarp that you can get for agricultural purposes. But is anyone else, Forrest, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yes, I do. I'm actually shopping for tarps right now. I made contact with call him a tarp salesman today, but not really. He's a landowner in the Chimicum Valley, and he has the tarps we need to kick off our Finn River project. And I'm going to make a bold request here for anybody who is really turned on by this and wants to see that blossom in a very visible place. You can make a donation to the Olympic Peninsula Prairies, which is a nonprofit organization, by going to our Facebook page, Olympic Peninsula Prairies. And there's some links there. And the main thing is we're still trying to create the website that will represent us. So anybody listening who knows a good web designer who is equally turned on by this information, we need you. I guess if there's going to be, Fred, do you have a place where people can follow up after this with information that I'm sure there's going to be a flood from what you've said tonight. That's where we could post the TARP information.
Yes, if Rosie, if you want to, if you can share screen again real quick, and I can post the couple of there is our email, Olympic Peninsula Prairies, our mailing address. And you can also email me at fsharpe@alaskawhalefoundation.org. When I'm not sauntering prairies, I'm up in Alaska chasing whales. And we'd love to hear from you. We'd love to get you in our information resources. We'd love to help you with your budding native prairies, and look forward to some field trips in the spring.
And Fred, if you could flip back a couple slides there to that little prairie burn that we did in Port Townsend, you showed a moment ago. Right there, yeah. That one. So this is actually in Port Townsend on a farm. It's from 2 years ago. We tarped that area for approximately 6 months, and you can see the tarp on the right. It's that white streak running. It was like folded or rolled up off to the right there. And then we went over that patch with little flame weeders because we didn't want to do an open burn because we would have to engage with the air quality monitors and so forth. So it was just to kind of consume the dry material that was left after the tarp had been covering that land. And you can see how nice and clean it left everything. So that is, if you want to visualize what it might be like in your garden area or your field to go from pasture grasses to prepared prairie soil, that's what it looks like.
Freddie, there's another question. Couple, which is great. One is, it's interesting that the camas grows so well in the wetlands. Can Gary oak be established in the wetlands also? That's one.
Not so much. Gary oak doesn't like to get its feet wet. It is interesting to see Gary oak occurs all the way down to Central California. As you go further south where it gets drier, it starts to move closer to wetland environments. But up here, there's sufficient moisture. It's usually going to do pretty well in the moderate to really dry sites.
Thanks, Fred. There's also one from Barbara Blackie. She says, asks, are there important mycorrhizal associations with specific prairie plants?
You know, there is actually, and there's some great resources online that you can look up to look at soil microbes. That's one of the really important things that we're trying to preserve here with our prairie soils, is the fact that there is a lot of associated soil bacteria. There is some soil mycorrhizas that associate with prairie plants. Prairies tend to be a little bit more basic as opposed to acidic. Mycorrhizae tend to do better, if I understand correctly, in more acidic environments. Here we have more basic prairie soils, but maintaining the soil microbes that act as the kind of the detritivores of that dead material and recycling it is very important. So one of the things that we try to do is we try to inoculate some of our, we use a lot of commercial soils right now because we know we can get a really high probability of sterility, not a lot of weeds in there, but we'd love to do more with native prairie soils, using those as inoculum to bring those important microbial community into our restoration efforts. Another great one to talk to if that would be Howard, what's his name, Forrest?
Yes, he's on this call.
Oh, he is. Well, Howard, do you want to jump in here?
Yeah, hi. Yeah, what's your question? Can you hear me okay?
Rosie? Yeah, the question is there important mycorrhizal and...
Yeah, you know what I would suggest to everybody is we can look at the Lake Mills and Lake Aldwell restoration as an example of a soil that is not acidic. You know, we're looking at basically glacial flour and gravels and things like that. And so it doesn't have the humic content that you find in either forest soils or in sphagnum-based prairie ecosystems. And so there are mycorrhizal relationships, although when we talk about that, these words get passed around a lot, and there's a lot of, I think, misperceptions about the different classifications of different types of mycorrhizal fungi. And so what I would suggest is to educate ourselves about the arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi, the ones that associate with specific plants in a variety of different ecosystems. And you know, that they're actually a really interesting group of fungi because there's, I think about 200 of them that have been identified worldwide, as opposed to other types of higher fungi. And these things tend to appear in localities along with the plants. And so what I mean by that is that if, for instance, you think you can, maybe use an inoculation or something like that, well, that may not be the case, that these things spontaneously appear in specific types of ecosystems in association with specific plants. So I think these are the types of mycorrhizas that we're going to find, at least in the central areas of prairies, although, around here, especially on the Olympic Peninsula, where so much of it is forested adjacent to it, I'm sure there's probably some of the ones that associate with trees that are getting in around the edges.
Thanks, Howard. There's a question from Cindy. She says, does tarping or cardboard mulch weed suppressant end up killing the mycorrhizal fungus? And if so, does it restore it? So if you kind of answered that, but is there anything else you wanted to add to that? Or anyone else?
No, I'll back up a little bit though on tarping off your lawn. You can do this on the cheap, and if you got some black plastic hanging around out in the garage, go ahead and use it. If you've got cardboard hanging around or a source, I see a lot of stores, they have bales of this stuff. Go get some and do your own thing. This is as much an art as it is a science. So have some fun, use what you can. You don't need to spend a lot of money, and good luck.
Thank you. Hey, Freddie, Diane Doss says, hi, Diane. Sound Native Plants in Olympia is closing their nursery soon. Fred, what do you think about importing South Sound Prairie genetics up here?
Great question. A typical tenet of conservation biology is use the most local sources that you can. But I think it probably kind of depends on the plant. I think that some of their South Sound plants may have come from North Sound material to begin with. If they've got cactus, chances are it came from up here. I would say first see if you can get it from a more local source, but if you can't, I would say it would probably be okay. You just walk into any garden section of any hardware store here, and you look at, they've got vast, you can buy 50-pound bags of grass seed. I mean, the amount of alleles that are pouring in here constantly of non-native grasses and seeds and plants is huge. And so I think a little bit of that, in the name of prairie restoration, is not going to be a big deal. But there's probably some elements that could even, I don't know, it'd be nice to see some of our native balsam root from the South Sound Prairies up here. It's probably not going to spread like wildfire. It's a very parsimonious plant. I would not necessarily think that would be a problem. I mean, go over to the gardens at H.J. Carroll Park. They've got plants from a variety of sources, and it's not like they're taking over or anything. So I think it's species dependent, but not always problematic. Anyway, great to hear from you, Diane.
And again, anyone's welcome to chime in with live questions. You don't have to put them in the chat right now. So Fred, you said that if people wanted some seeds, did you say that you had some that were available, or were you sending people to?
Yeah, I would say you'd certainly, you're welcome to get in touch, and if you want to reflect on what you'd like to do and what you've got, I'm happy to field questions. My email's posted there at the end. Also talking with Forrest Schomer, Inside Passion Seeds. It's a fantastic source for local seeds, and Forrest could give you lots of quality feedback about where the seeds came from and the suitability for a given site. But sounds like people are probably ready to go and enjoy the rest of their Saturday evening. So I'd like to put out a heartfelt thank you to everyone who joined, and super excited going forward. Look forward to getting together with you all on field trips out in the field. Please stay in touch with our local prairie organizations, Native Plant Society, Olympic Peninsula Prairies. Also want to thank Michael and Mary Jane Blanton for allowing us to use their beautiful home here for this Zoom activities. Thank you, Rosie, for being a moderator. And may you all get out on our beautiful prairies this winter. Thank you so much.
All right, Freddie.
Thanks, Fred.
Before you go, Freddie, there's a comment from Stan Graham, who says that 2 weeks ago, are you still listening, Freddie? 2 weeks ago, Dave and I found an oak grove with 30 to 40 stems, 10 to 20 dBH on the edge of a wetland in the middle of an industrial forest. It is a relative place of safety for them. Winter Creek in Mason County has several miles of oak along its edge. So that's just kind of cool addition to the oak wetland question.
Yeah, yeah. I don't know if Dave Peters is still on.
Yeah, hi Fred, this is Dave, can you hear me?
It's loud and clear.
Okay, yeah. No, first of all, I just want to say, hey, thanks for this great talk tonight. I always enjoy your expansive view of prairies. It's always great. I mean, we get from alpine down to seashore every time you talk. That's great. I love it. Yeah, actually, oaks. Just following up on what Stan said, oaks do grow around wetlands, and it's not all that uncommon. Basically, they want a place in the sunshine. I would say that when they're around wetlands, they either need some access to some drier soil, maybe on the uphill side, or it's got to dry out in the summertime. But yeah, I've found them growing out of sluice edge before, so it's they want their place in the sun.
Excellent. Yeah, they certainly have a wide ecological tolerance, but it's amazing how they become more of a riparian species as you get south. And I saw that patch there at Oak Patch Preserve that's having lots of problems with beavers chewing into them.
Yeah.
Well, look forward to further reflections with you, Dave and Stan, and thanks again, everyone, for turning out.
Yep, thanks.
Thanks, Fred.
Good night.
Thank you, Fred.
Thanks, Fred.
Thanks. It was great.
Thanks, Fred. Good job. Great job, actually.
Thanks, Rosie.
My pleasure. Thanks for coming, everybody.
Fabulous.